spiritual decay is a moral decay, is a societal decay. So it's not just, people aren't going to temple anymore, like what's going on? It's like, no, this will cause a collapse of our civilization. Welcome back, or welcome to the Monday Muse. Today we are talking about prophecy and prophets. When I was preparing for a different episode, one of our Friday episodes, on just prophecy in general, the nature of prophets, who are they, kind of both in Scripture, archetypally, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with Thomas on prophets and prophecy, and I didn't realize that he wrote so much, and it was very, very fascinating. And there's a section in one of the books written by Father Victor White on prophecy, prophecy, Thomas, Revelation, Jung, all that. And I was so intrigued by it, I kept reading more about it even after the episode was done, and I didn't need to. So I thought we should do some episodes on prophecy and prophets. It's an intriguing topic. And so this first episode that we'll do on prophets and prophecy is just about prophets and prophecy in general, the phenomenon of it, how they appear in both the Old and New Testament, their function, everything like that. Because the idea is to get down some definitions, some understanding, and then when we mention them in later episodes, we'll have some foundation for understanding what they are, and we can build a discussion from there. So let's dive into the phenomena of prophecy. So if we look at world religions, particularly the ancient Near East is what we'll be covering, because that's the area of where Israel grew out of, is the ancient Near East. If we look at those religions, it's certain that prophecy is kind of a universal phenomenon. I would say that probably among all religions, but particularly in that area. And it seems to be something that both, maybe advanced or sophisticated religions, we would say, have, and also primitive religions. But one common misunderstanding about prophecy, I think both for the Israelites' prophets and for prophets in general, is the idea that they foretell the future, they're fortune tellers. But that's really a subset, I think, of prophecy, is foretelling the future, than it is prophecy in general. So for both the surrounding cultures and Israel, prophecy was really about mediation and interpretation of the divine mind or will, the will of the divine, whatever that may be, the gods or otherwise. How do we understand what they're saying, and the prophet mediated from the gods to humans, which is, how Israel will understand it as well. Even the term that we use for prophet comes from the Greek prophetes, and that means someone who, again, interprets the divine mind and makes the word of God, the will of God, known through various means that we'll get into. And so it has this primary meaning of speaking on behalf of somebody. And that was true even in the ancient Near East. The prophets spoke on behalf of their gods. So sometimes pinning down what the prophet did, both in Israel and in the ancient Near East, can be a little tricky. But the primary idea is that they're a spokesperson. And the original word in the Hebrew, nabi, it kind of retains that meaning. I think the origin of it is a little unknown or a little confused. It is a Semitic word, so it's unsure. Did Israel kind of get this from somewhere else in the ancient Near East, or was it their own word? But it's interesting that the verb of it, to prophesy, it means to act like a prophet, to exhibit the behavior typical of prophets. So really, the prophet is made known by his behavior. And this will become a defining feature for how Israel discerns false prophets. But it really, I think, goes to the heart of that. It's a kind of a mode of being, as opposed to, again, telling the future, some tarot card stuff going on. But in again, the general phenomenon of it, the prophet really does take on a public role in religion. They're not really used necessarily for private religion, except for perhaps some kings might keep them on hand. But for the most part, they're there to, again, make known something mysterious. And the reason why they would make that known is because the gods or God has something to do with the people, that ethical behavior, something, how he wants to be worshipped, whatever it may be. So the prophet, because he's acknowledged to be one by his actions, is associated with rational speech and interpretation. So the inspired person, or the inspiration of revelation, needs an interpretation, which I think, I don't want to get too off topic here, but I think that's kind of interesting that the prophet works as an interpreter. That really, it goes to show that all revelation, even in the ancient world or in non-Christian world, the divine is not self-evident. There's always a form of mediation going on. And so there will always be this need for someone who acts as an intermediary.
Right, and at the very least, there's always a kind of missing of the mark of the instantiation of said revelation, and then that means there would need to be somebody who can remind us of the proper interpretation of what has been said.
Yep.
So that need for prophet is always there.
And that's when we get into Israel, that's like their thing, is to remind people of how is the divine will supposed to be put into practice and embodied. How is it not being done? How is it being done? So on. So in both the ancient Near East and in Israel, the communication of prophecy, how prophets receive prophecy, is pretty uniform. You have visions, dreams, ecstatic experiences, but prophecy is considered a type of charism, which we consider to be even today in the church. It's something that's given to someone for a time, and then perhaps for the rest of their life or taken away, comes and goes. So the fact that prophecy seems to come and go, is kind of interesting, like archetypally about like the spirit of prophecy. The spirit is kind of comes and goes. It's associated with the wind, but also it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the person's orthodoxy or holiness. Right. So it kind of makes the prophet is a tricky figure because of this. Like you can't really, because prophecy is received, you can't just do it whenever you want. And so it's like, are you really a prophet, or are you just pulling us around? And then also, if a person is deemed not morally good, how do we know this person is telling the truth? I don't know. So the best records, I think, from when I was researching a little bit about prophecy in the ancient Near East, or I guess cultures that Israel had regular contact with, is Babylon. It's kind of the major cultures they were in contact with, kind of the Mesopotamian area, Egypt, Canaan, and that have their own priest prophets that Elijah famously slays, and then Babylon. So Babylon had these kind of temple priests that would deliver messages to recipients, the people, whoever came for their instruction. It's interesting that their message was considered divine and a prophetic instruction, but the word for this prophetic instruction is closely related to the Hebrew word, or the Semitic word, of Torah. Torah is instruction, and I don't know if it has divine in there, but either way, it has this kind of emphasis. The prophetic message has the emphasis on something I guess really to be put into practice, received and then practically lived. So the other type of kind of the Babylonian prophet was the ecstatic, so somebody who is under divine possession. Now that was fairly common from what I saw in the ancient Near East, the people that were under some sort of divine possession. And this isn't, I think we think of divine possession as either A, evil, or B, maybe fake, and maybe we can even add a C, which is, mental illness or of some sort. But, for these people, it's not a part of like a profane magic. I guess I should say like a cheap magic. It was actually like really, really kind of part and parcel of the religion that there are special people clearly who are set apart to receive messages and interpret them. And part of this is that they exhibit signs of possession and they, act in strange ways. And even the prophets of Israel have some of these behaviors, and sometimes it draws ridicule, as you'll see in the different prophetic letters. Actually, I don't know. Prophetic, what are they? The letters, epistles? I don't even know what they're called. Actually, I didn't really think about it. But one interesting thing, though, is the distinction is much more pronounced in Israel between the priest and the prophet, whereas in the ancient Near East, it seems like they're kind of combined into one, which we actually kind of do even in, I feel like now in the Catholic Church, you have the priest, prophet, and king, and them all the triple munra in one. The priest acts as an intermediary. Some priests in Israel or some prophets were also priests, but for the most part, it's the priesthood for Israel is really about hereditary, passed down through families, and it's also hierarchical. Whereas prophecy is seen as much more charismatic. You do get some temple prophets, so people kind of group together, but for the most part, you also get individuals. Elijah is kind of considered a charismatic prophet. He doesn't really belong to a group of prophets yet. And then there's others that, again, are priest prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah. So the similarities that I'm trying to highlight here is not to kind of flatten it and say like all prophecy is just like there's nothing unique about Israel's prophecy. That's not true. But it is to say that there's a common pattern or a consistent pattern that of inspired people speaking a word of the divine or God to their religions. And I think that the fact that the pattern exists is actually more in Israel's favor than it not existing. Sometimes I think we want to see like pure, like this didn't happen anywhere else.
Right.
Like because it belongs only to the people of God, only to special people. But actually, I don't think that would make it more believable.
Well, it's like the conversation around like the religious impulse.
Yeah.
And so if you can speak on it on like broader terms, that this is something that we have a proclivity towards as human beings, that doesn't negate the truth about religion or Christianity in that sense, but it like emphasizes that there's a fulfillment of our nature in something like religion. And so if we're just thinking in that mode of just like our proclivity towards a religious impulse in a natural sense, then that means embedded in that would be the need for something like a prophecy to correct said religious practices and experiences, just on the natural level. Again, aside from like whether one religion is right or wrong.
Right. And I think that's exactly it. Again, it also ties into the conversation about mediation. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, so religion does have this impulse. It does seem like there's some sort of divine communication happening. Again, we'll just take it for what it is. We don't have to be skeptical about whether or not it's true. It's just, this is what's being claimed, so we'll take it as true. And it seems as though it's not completely self-evident as to what the meaning of the revelation is. So every culture claims that there is a divine communicating to them, so naturally there would be a prophecy pattern to interpret what that is. So, like I said, the prevalence of the prophetic pattern is all over the ancient Near East. However, Israel has a distinctive pattern to it that I would like to get into and talk a little bit about Israel and their prophecy. So, biblical prophecy in Israel begins with Moses. He has a little bit of a speech at the end in Deuteronomy about how to recognize what a prophet is. Thomas will address the question, is Moses the greatest prophet? Or is it John the Baptist? But it really begins with him, and the biblical corpus, the Old Testament, will kind of expand the definition to really anyone who is, kind of an inspired person. So obviously Moses really, falls into the category of prophet because he communicates with God, sees him face to face. He delivers divine messages. He's clearly a mediator going up and down the mountain. Not everybody can communicate with God. He goes up, God communicates to him. He comes down to the people, delivers the messages, the 10 Commandments. So these so it begins with Moses, and then it seems kind of more or less silent. You have a few people in the book of Judges that act as prophets, but it doesn't really pick back up until Samuel, who is identified as a prophet, and he is a part of kind of a group of prophets. He lives in the temple. And the prophets in Israel follow the same pattern of revelation, in that if we look at how they receive these visions, or how they receive divine communications, it's still through, it appears, visions, dreams, different experiences. Again, sometimes these experiences are very strange, but it's clear that the Israelite prophets, sometimes maybe to their dislike, are radically changed by their experience. You can think of Jonah, who isn't quite happy, I guess, that he's receiving communications from God, but nonetheless he does, and there's something that I guess he's changed by that experience. So, as an institution, I guess prophecy as an institution to Israel, the highlight, I guess the high point of it, is in the monarchy, when really with starting with King Saul. Again, Saul and the prophecy of Samuel overlap, and then you get David and Solomon and such. They all have their kind of like side prophets of the prophet Nathan, kind of just hanging out there as David's go-to guy. So these prophets act in a way that act in relationship to the monarchy, really as a way to continually call the monarchy to follow the will of God. To again, there's a way in which God's will needs to be instantiated that it's more likely than not being carried out. Sometimes the prophets approve of the actions of the king, sometimes they don't. But nonetheless, that's part of their content of preaching.
So still in the line of interpretation of divine revelation, and then like in relationship to the king, it's whether or not he's fulfilling said implementation. Right.
It's you have been, I guess, chosen king. I was going to say elected, but elected in a broad sense, like of God's choosing you. You have been chosen king, and therefore you are responsible for being faithful to the covenant.
Right.
And you, in many ways, the people will follow whatever the king does. And so if you are unfaithful, the people will probably follow in that. And
right. The role of the king is to enact a pattern that he sees above him, right? The
Right.
election from God would be that you are going to be a mediator to the people of the divine pattern, and so then therefore the prophet is like, well, how's that going for you?
Yeah, right, right. And if you follow the pattern, things will go well.
Right.
That's Moses' kind of last sermon to the Israelites is, if you follow the covenant, if you follow the commandments that we've laid down, you will keep the land. If you do not follow the pattern, you will not keep the land. And we all know how that ends up. So one of the unique things about the prophets of Israel and their preaching, which is perhaps not surprising, is their kind of insistence on monotheism. That there is one God that is to be worshipped, and not the many gods of the nations. So maybe prophets of the ancient Near East either kind of synchronized the other gods or were maybe polytheistic themselves. But the prophets insist that there is one God, and because of that, everything is under his control. So we'll see that the prophets are really interpreters of events, and they see it from the vantage point of this one God who orders all events underneath of him, and everything that happens as an expression of his will, the will of the one God. So how are we to make sense of Israel's defeats, their exiles, everything like that? We know that really through the prophets. And something that's kind of interesting that's tied to their monotheism, their insistence on monotheism, is that the prophets are really invested in the other countries too. Like, they're always these oracles against the nations, and they're talking about what are other nations doing? How are they worshiping and everything like that? Or what do they worship? And the prophets, like I said, because that they're very public people who reflect on all the happenings, really all the events of the world. I don't want to give away too much about where we might go with the series, but it does make me think of the people who we consider to be prophets today, and how interested they are. They're not detached people who kind of come out of nowhere and say something and flee again. They're actually very involved and very curious about the happenings of the world. I would say not just even their own nation, but what are people doing?
Yeah, even on the, I know this is like for later, but the psychological aspect of monotheism is that there's a one proper orientation. And so the call, the emphasis that there's a one godness to your being insists that, like, when things are not going according to the pattern of which I am in the role to interpret, it means that you have disordered your life in a polytheistic way, in a sense of like something else is drawing your attention to which you worship, and that is disordering you from this particular orientation. So that call for reorientation to a oneness is like completely coherent with like the call for the one God.
Yeah, right. And there is that scattering effect of Israel when they start worshiping foreign gods, as they're always called. Sometimes, depending upon your translation, foreign will be translated pagan, but it's really very synonymous. Alien, foreign, and pagan are synonymous terms. So you're worshiping something out of the ordinary or something that is not native to you, and you are scattering yourself to go after these other gods, and that's causing nation-wide kind of scattering.
Right.
That one thing certainly that we as modern people do not appreciate is the interconnectedness of religion, worship, and just society. So a spiritual decay is a moral decay, is a societal decay. So it's not just, people aren't going to temple anymore, like what's going on? It's like, no, this will cause a collapse of our civilization.
Right.
As, again, if you read the letters, or if you read the prophets, of course, that's what happens, because, and this is an emphasis in their preaching, you have forgotten the God who led you to this land, and now you've, again, another popular word for foreign worship is you've played the harlot. You've gone after, I'm your spouse, and you've gone after a spouse that is not your own. So therefore now you are, the moral order can't last with foreign worship.
Right. Yeah, that foreign thing is so interesting, especially as it relates to the opposite of that, which would be like native, familial. Like your identity has to be central, of which you are in relationship to God, right? That monotheistic attention. And otherwise you are looking for identity on the outside to foreign things. And that's the emphasis. So like, no, remember, right? From that scattering to a like remembering of yourself and your identity. And it's a one God orientation.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the, like the deeper pattern that the prophets are trying to get at is the oneness of God comes down to all of Israel. It's like oneness of God, oneness of king, oneness of nation, oneness of everything. It's not just kind of a strict battle between God or the gods,
right,
but actually of the whole nation, including the individual, down to them. So Israel has the prophets in Israel have a particular relationship to the other institutions. We can think of those as the law and the priesthood. Then you have the cult, which is the temple worship, essentially. Talked about the monarchy a little bit, and then essentially just religious practice. So the relationship between the prophets and the law and the priesthood, I think sometimes, and I've fallen into this, is like you really want to see it as like an archetypal battle between like the institution of the priesthood and the law, and then the prophets, who are sort of like the fringe characters that reject the law. But not only are some of the prophets also priests, it's not quite the right way, I guess, to look at their relationship. The relationship between prophets and the priesthood is really, they're not condemning the priesthood. They're condemning what they are or are not teaching. So really that they've rejected the law or they've ignored the law, and they're teaching something to which God never intended. So it's not, well, I mean, what we'll see is that the prophets don't really call into question institutions, which seems, again, like we want to see the prophet as like a revolutionary figure. They actually see the institutions as legitimate. It's usually the individuals and the way in which the institutions have gone wrong. That's really at the heart of prophetic preaching, is how have these institutions been corrupted and decayed?
That's a subtle point that has like a huge difference in how that plays out, and like even in yourself, of like you see an institution, it's corrupt. How does one correct those things? And then what do you think of institutions in general? Because like it's not revolution for revolution's sake. It's like you're trying to establish the right order. The right order has to manifest in some sort of hierarchical form. So you have to at least appreciate the need for institutions. And so the critique is of corruption and not institution itself.
That's right. So they're internal reformers. I mean, sometimes we want to see reformers as people that take an institution and like make it something else. They're working within Israel. And again, they're not French Jacobins that are like, let's just burn the whole thing down, or the king is illegitimate, we should have like a constitutional republic or something. It's like, no, they're saying the king is maybe corrupt and perhaps he needs to be replaced, but they're not saying there should be no kings. It's like, well, there's the law, there's the priesthood, there's the temple, there's the cult, all this, it should stay. But there's something going on. The corruption, as you point out, is something that needs to be needs to be changed. So they really both the priest I think part of the reason why they don't condemn the priesthood in general is that there's a lot of overlap between them. Kind of as we pointed out before, that the priests transmit the will of God through the tradition of religious law, and through the temple, and prophets accomplish the same task, but through kind of a living word. And that's usually where we would want to see, or would like to see, the opposition is one is law and tradition, and the other is this living word, which I think is something that we need to see in ourselves, as you pointed out. Like, you are both priest and prophet. There's an institution that should be upheld, and there are boundaries, and you do need law, but it should be practiced with a living word, this personal encounter that revitalizes whatever's corrupt.
Right.
Which is again, the role of the prophet, to revitalize a corrupted system. So the other thing along with this is the cults, the worship in the temple. And again, I think we want to see the opposition here as the prophet is kind of like he's a spiritual but not religious, and the cult is religious but not spiritual. That they want to do away with how the cult's been practiced. And if you read the prophets superficially, it does kind of seem like they're saying sacrifice is wrong, or it's not good. Sacrifice, you do not wish for me, but an open ear, obedience to your law. So obedience is greater than sacrifice. So be obedient and get rid of sacrifice. But they're not really in principle against animal sacrifice or against sacrifice in general, but it's actually that there's something more existential going on. It's not that these sacrifices are unworthy. It's more that there's something that has become external about sacrifice.
Right. We just discussed this about humility on our Friday episode, about how the external actions can themselves be, cause for suspicion. It was like, what is your motive underneath that? That doesn't mean that you should not have external actions. It's really like revealing this kind of structure of reality that, like, our actions and the things we do can lead themselves to become masks that allow for corruption underneath. That, like, you're doing ritualistic behavior and religious practices without the right disposition. And then how does one autocorrect? How does one correct that corruption underneath to that disposition without getting rid of the need for the external actions in the end?
Yeah, right. I think in our own modern world, it's we spiritualize the sacrifice. It's like it's a spiritual sacrifice. Do you need to go to church? Like, what's a big deal? Like,
right.
I don't need to. That's a rule. Especially with us Catholics, it's so rule based. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, but you still need them, right, and you should still live them. In fact, they are life giving, but they can decay,
right.
And they can become external.
Just to check a box,
right?
Yeah,
you can, of course, your spiritual life and your relationship to God and your relationship towards religion can be just routine, but that doesn't mean that those things are. That doesn't mean that religion and dogma is wrong. Right. It just means that you need to have this life-giving word or encounter in it. That to revitalize it. Jung said that people use dogma and doctrine as like a substitute for religious experience, right, and perhaps that's true. But I think that's the critique here is it's just an external with no kind of existential quality to it. So the issue at stake for the prophets was that the temples were carrying out sort of a sacramentalism devoid of meaning, which I think is, again, something that is very, very possible, or it can happen even now. So it's not that the sacrifices that they were carrying out were not commanded by the Lord. I want, love, not sacrifice. It's more that there can be no true sacrifice without love. So you need both. Sacrifice, do the external thing, but do it with love. So the prophet's attitude is trying to get back to the realities, that there's the forms of worship are secondary to the realities. So you're supposed to sacrifice to the Lord with a loving heart. But I see many people sacrificing without that aspect. And they think that they're okay because they just adhere to the law without any love. So that's at the heart of the prophetic critique, which I think, as I was preparing for a lot of this, makes me think about the prophets much in a different way now. I think before I was really much on the antagonistic, that they propelled, in a lot of ways, I think they do propel religion forward. But it does, again, it seems like they're only doing so by this cycle of death and renewal that they're moving forward. Like, they're actually not changing the institutions. They're changing them insofar as corruption is being called out and hopefully cleaned out, but the institution remains. And it remains essentially like what it is. Like, priests are still going to be priests. And
I'm reminded of the Psalm 51, which is like something people quote as a case against that kind of religiosity corruption, of saying, like, you do not take pleasure in burnt offering, the sacrifice of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Like, see? No sacrifice, just, it's really about the disposition of heart. Keep reading. By your favor do good in Zion, build the walls of Jerusalem, then you will delight in righteous sacrifices. Right? So, like, it's still there. We're just making sure that it's all filled with that living word.
yeah,
So it's like, again, this is not a disregard for the external actions. This is a fulfillment of them and making sure they don't go corrupt.
right. Again, it's supposed to give them back the reality that they're supposed to signify, and not just a dead sacramentalism,
That's
just
right.
a dead form with no reality to it. So the other aspect, the other institution that prophecy is in contact with, we've talked about a little bit before already, the monarchy. And in many ways, the monarchy acts as like a stimulus, because if you read a lot of the prophets, they're really going after the kings. They're going hard after them. And again, they're not really acting as a revolutionary. They're never calling for the destruction of the kings. They're not the French revolutionaries. They're just saying that the king can turn the tide of their spiritual, physical strife, whatever it is, war, if they return to covenant faithfulness. But oftentimes that doesn't happen, and so now they're paying the price for not listening to prophecy. So they have a strong relationship, again, with monarchies in many ways. The prophets and the monarchs kind of grow up together. Again, you have Samuel and Saul at the very beginning, growing up, or springing up together. And really, I think, and we see this with David for sure, and David in his prophet, is that the prophets function, and prophets in the prophecies function as a way to form the conscience of the people. Like, they're sort of, I would say, archetypally an external form of conscience. That, again, the structures have decayed. The structures have they've been infiltrated or whatever. They've corrupted, and they need to get back to why they were put there in the first place. Why was the king made the king? Why do we have temple sacrifice? Why do we have the priesthood? And they're there to function as somebody who, again, is making the will of God known on why and how they should be reformed. So they're this external conscience calling the people to was it kind of cast off the works of evil, wicked works, and return to the Lord. Return to the Lord. That's their main thrust. And return to the Lord in love, and therefore your sacrifices will then become acceptable because they're done not simply out of this blind and routine obedience, but actually because one is filled with love of God. So the last, of course, is their preaching on the Messiah, and that's really, I think, a good connection to the New Testament, because a lot of the prophetic teaching on eschatology, the coming of the Messiah, all that obviously is fulfilled in the New Testament, in the coming of Christ. One interesting thing, though, before we leave the Old Testament, is how prophets really did see time as moving forward. I think the idea that time has a beginning and an end is something very unique to Israel, and then even into Christianity, that time is not just a circle, a kind of an endless cycle, but actually has a beginning in the beginning, with Genesis, and then it's moving towards this universal fulfillment with the Messiah. So the prophets have that kind of on the horizon. That's what they're looking for. And if we think of prophecy as something that is kind of the inspired word of God, then in this, the prophets are speaking directly to the people. And they're speaking about a living word that will be fulfilled in some way or another. And this is what makes prophecy both intriguing and, I think, for their time, frustrating, because it's not fulfilled. Again, it's as, prophets are people who see the future, but in a dim way. They see it through a form of knowledge that I know for certain that the Messiah is coming, but I just kind of don't know when. Again, it's the certainty but not clarity of faith, that we can rest that God is coming, but we just are not really sure when. Except for when the prophets do come in the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't have too much on prophecy in a sense. I mean, it has a lot of prophecy fulfillment, but you don't hear, I would say, a lot about prophets acting. Of course, we have John the Baptist is the preeminent prophet in the New Testament. Jesus is viewed as a prophet. He doesn't take on that language himself, but certainly his gifts of healing, some of his, the foretelling of the destruction of Jerusalem, his life is often interpreted. He interprets his own life in light of the prophets, that he will suffer just like the prophets. So while not explicitly saying he's a prophet, he is certainly identifying with them. One person that I think we don't often, or at least I don't often, consider as a prophet is Paul. And mainly because Paul frames himself as an apostle. And he does so for a few reasons, but he sees himself as an apostle because he's seen the Lord, which is kind of interesting, that in order for someone to be considered an apostle, they have to have seen Jesus. And he sees Jesus on the road to Damascus, and therefore says, like, more than a prophet, I'm actually an apostle. Because prophecy is something that's sort of, again, it's transient, it comes and goes, it's seen as a charismatic gift, but he is saying to have seen the Lord is better than to be a prophet. So I've seen the Lord. I'm an apostle. I'm an apostle. But if you listen to what he says in his own writings, like in Galatians, he says that God set me apart before I was born and called me through grace. And this is very much comparable to Isaiah. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you to be a prophet to the nations. And Paul very much says, I am a prophet to the nations, I'm a prophet to the Gentiles, even though he doesn't use that word for himself, prophet. But if prophecy is kind of being a spokesperson for God and is inspired speech, then that's all over his letters. Because unless he explicitly says, I don't really, this isn't a revelation, I forget which letter he says that. It's like, this is basically just an opinion, take it or leave it. But a lot of times he's saying, this is something I've received from the Lord. That's his, that's his authority, is that I have a special commission and authority to preach to you, because what I'm preaching to you is not my word, but the word of God itself. So he says, on the word of the Lord I preach this. I have the Spirit of the Lord. I have the mind of Christ. So this is very much inspired prophecy, in his opinion, which is important to highlight, because I've heard some people make this argument that you have the New Testament, you have the Gospels, and that's Jesus' words, and you gotta follow Jesus' words. But like, Paul is not Jesus. He's just a man. So you can take it or leave it in a different way than Jesus. And it is sort of unfortunate, because you have all these prophets leading up to Jesus. Jesus comes and is like the prophet of prophets. So why listen to anyone else?
Yeah.
And then you have Paul afterwards saying, well, I'm a prophet. So and then even now, prophecy is still a thing. So who do you listen to? Do you listen only to Jesus, or do you listen to Paul? But if we recall that a prophet is as a mediator, we still need Paul after Jesus. We still need someone to interpret the events of the life of Christ, of which Paul is one of the preeminent interpreters. So you can't kind of just take it or leave it. You need, again, this mediator, even in your own, I think, kind of struggle and wrestle with reading the Bible. You need a teacher. And Paul is saying, you have received Christ, you've been baptized, you're a believer now. Now, let me answer some difficult questions, which are a lot of his letters, his different issues. And he's saying that as a spokesperson for God, I can speak on his behalf, which is a bold claim. But that's prophecy in as fast as I could. I didn't want to make it too long, but I wanted to get into this because when we talk about prophecy later, as it appears in Thomas's writings and in the other authors we'll get into, you might ask, okay, but what is prophecy? What is a prophet? So you can refer to this.